My daughter and I put on the performance of our lives that weekend, and by Sunday morning, the man she almost married walked straight into the trap we'd set, with a smile on his face and not a single clue what was waiting for him. Let me back up. My name is Frederick. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a postal supervisor in Columbus, Ohio, raised 2 kids, mostly on my own, after my wife Evelyn passed. And I like to think I know people. Not in a paranoid way. Just in the way a man gets when he's lived long enough to recognize when something doesn't add up. My daughter Rosalind, Rosie, I've called her since she was 3, is 31 now. She's a physical therapist, works at a rehabilitation center over on the east side of Columbus. Sharp girl, organized. She makes spreadsheets for her grocery lists. I used to tease her about it. So when she came to me 2 years ago talking about this man she'd met at a friend's birthday dinner, I paid attention. She wasn't the kind of woman who got swept up in things, but she was swept up in this one. His name was Bennett Ashford. He told Rosie he was a property investor, said he had holdings in Cincinnati and a few developments up near Cleveland. He drove a nice car, leased, I found out later, and he had that particular kind of confidence that comes from practice, not substance. The kind where a man looks you right in the eye and says exactly what you need to hear, and only later do you realize he'd been watching you long enough to know what that was. I didn't trust him from the first dinner. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't anything he said or did that night. He was perfectly pleasant. He helped clear the table. He asked about my years with the Postal Service like he genuinely found it interesting. He told Rosie she looked beautiful twice. Not more, not less, which is a calculated number when you think about it. Too few and you seem indifferent. Too many and you seem desperate. Twice is just right. Twice is a man who has done this before. But I didn't say anything to Rosie, because I had nothing concrete. And I knew my daughter. She would have chalked it up to the overprotective father routine, and she wouldn't have been entirely wrong to do so. So I watched. I stayed close. I had Sunday dinners with them at my house, and I paid attention. The engagement came 14 months in. Bennett proposed at a restaurant downtown, had the ring brought out in a dessert, the whole production. Rosie called me from the parking lot after, crying happy, and I sat in my armchair and told her I was thrilled for her, and I meant half of it. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of April, out at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside Columbus. One of those venues with white string lights and a covered barn and a view of the hills. Rosie had been planning it for 8 months. 212 guests. Her college roommate as maid of honor. My sister Cordette flying in from Atlanta. 4 weeks before the wedding, I drove out to the venue to drop off some framed photos Rosie wanted to display at the reception. Pictures of her mother. Pictures of our family. The coordinator wasn't there yet. I arrived about 20 minutes early, parked around the side of the building like she told me to, and walked around toward the barn entrance. That's when I heard him. Bennett was standing near the side door of the barn, phone pressed to his ear, laughing. I stopped. Something in the laugh made me stop. I've heard men laugh like that before. Loose, careless, the way men get when they believe nobody who matters is listening. I stayed where I was, behind a section of wooden fencing with climbing vines on it. I'm not proud of that standing there, but I am not sorry for it either. She has no idea, he said. None. Her father set up this college fund thing years ago, some kind of family trust situation. It rolls over to her when they get married. She mentioned it once, and I don't think she even realizes what she said. A pause. It's substantial, man. We're talking low 6 figures. And after 6 months of marriage in Ohio, you're already looking at equitable distribution on joint property. I just need to get through the ceremony. Another pause. He laughed again. I know, but she's sweet. She's not going to cause problems. Her dad's just some retired mailman. What's he gonna do? I stood there for I don't know how long. Long enough for Bennett to finish the call, push through the side door and go inside. Long enough for my hands to stop shaking. I sat in my truck for 45 minutes before I drove home. That trust he was talking about. He was right that it existed. My wife Evelyn had set it up before she passed. $114,000 held in a trust that transferred to Rosie upon marriage. It was meant to help her buy a house, start a family. Evelyn had cried when she signed the paperwork. I remember she said she wanted to make sure our girl was taken care of even after we were both gone. This man intended to get his hands on it. The question was what to do about it. I went home and sat in my kitchen for a long time. My first instinct, and I mean my very first, the one that came before any rational thought, was to drive to wherever Bennett was staying and handle it the way men handle things before lawyers and restraining orders. I'm 63. I know better. But the instinct was there. My second instinct was to call Rosie right then, tell her everything. But I thought about how she would react. She loved this man. She had spent 8 months planning a life around him. She was going to need more than what I'd heard through a barn wall. She was going to need something she could hold in her hands. So I made a decision. I called my brother-in-law, Desmond, Evelyn's brother, who is a retired Cuyahoga County Sheriff's deputy and is not someone who panics. I told him what I'd heard. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You need documentation. Don't do a thing until you have documentation." He was right. Over the next 10 days, I made some calls. I have a friend from my postal days, a woman named Agnes, whose son works in financial services down in Cincinnati. I asked him to quietly look into Bennett Ashwood's property investment claims. It took him 3 days. There were no substantial holdings. There was one LLC registered 2 years ago with no assets attached to it. There were 2 credit cards with significant balances. There was a prior engagement, a woman in Dayton, that had ended abruptly 18 months before Bennett appeared in Columbus. I later found out from a mutual connection that the woman in Dayton had also come from a family with money. I also found out about the debt. Bennett owed somewhere north of $80,000, credit cards, a personal loan from someone who was apparently no longer friendly about it, and unpaid rent on an apartment he'd vacated in the middle of the night the previous year. The man was drowning. He had been drowning for years, and he had found my daughter and her mother's trust fund, and he had decided she was the life raft. I am a man who goes to church most Sundays. I believe in doing things right. And I knew that if I wanted to protect Rosie, truly protect her, I had to do it in a way that couldn't be undone, not a confrontation that he could charm his way out of, not an accusation she might doubt. Something clean, something final. I called Desmond again. We talked for 2 hours. Then I called Rosie. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear the wedding checklist energy in her voice even before she said hello. I asked if I could come by that evening, just to talk. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. I watched her face go through every stage: confusion, disbelief, anger, grief, the way weather moves across the sky in autumn. Fast and dark and with no warning. She didn't cry right away. She sat very still for a long time and then she said quietly, "I need to hear it for myself." I told her I understood. I told her what I needed her to do. What we agreed on that night required 2 things from Rosie that I would not have asked of anyone else. It required her to keep showing up, to the final dress fitting, to the rehearsal dinner, to the wedding morning, and act as though nothing had changed. And it required her to trust me completely. She did both. We picked up a small digital recorder, the kind that clips inside a jacket pocket, from an electronics store out in Gahanna. Ohio is a one-party consent state. I'd confirmed that with Desmond. I only needed my own consent to record a conversation I was part of. 3 days before the wedding, I called Bennett and asked him to have dinner with me. Father-in-law, son-in-law. A tradition, I told him. Something I did. He agreed without hesitation. That was how confident he was. We went to a steakhouse on the north side of Columbus. He ordered the ribeye and a glass of bourbon, and he talked for a while about his investment plans and the house he intended to find for him and Rosie after the honeymoon. He was good. He was very, very good. Warm and detailed and comfortable with eye contact. If I hadn't heard what I'd heard of the vineyard, I might have sat there cutting my steak and thinking my daughter had made a fine choice. But I had heard it. and so I had a different job at that dinner. I talked about Evelyn, about the trust fund she had set up. I watched his eyes when I mentioned the amount. It was subtle, just a small contraction around the pupils, the way a man looks when he hears a number he's already been thinking about. He said all the right things. What a beautiful legacy. What a thoughtful woman she must have been. Then I told him there was a problem with the trust. I said the financial advisor had flagged something. A procedural issue. Nothing alarming, probably, but it might require some documentation from Bennett before the transfer could go through. Financial background. Proof of assets. Something about the way the trust was structured and Ohio's marital property rules. I watched him process this. He kept his expression neutral, but his jaw tightened, just once for less than a second. He said, of course, whatever was needed, he'd be happy to cooperate with whatever the financial advisor required. I said I appreciated that and changed the subject to football, and he followed me easily, and we finished dinner like two men who liked each other fine. The recorder in my jacket had gotten everything. I played it back that night with Desmond sitting at my kitchen table. We listened twice. Bennett hadn't said anything incriminating directly. Not that night. But the dinner had done something else. It had confirmed what we needed to do next. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 5:15 without an alarm. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table for an hour just thinking about Evelyn. About how she would have handled this. She was a quieter person than me, more careful. She would have wanted everything done without a scene. She would have wanted Rosie to walk away from this with her dignity intact, not with 200 guests watching her cry at the altar. That was the piece I had wrestled with the most. The version of this that the audience at the reception wanted, I knew, was a dramatic unmasking. The recording played through the venue speakers, Bennett standing there in his tuxedo while everyone heard exactly who he was. Part of me wanted that too. I'm human. I wanted the man humiliated in front of every person he'd smiled at and shaken hands with over the past 14 months. But Rosie didn't want that. She told me clearly she did not want her wedding day, not even the ruins of it, to become a spectacle. She wanted it handled quietly and completely, so that when it was over, it was over. So Desmond and I had spent 2 evenings building a different kind of trap. The plan depended on one thing: Bennett's greed outlasting his patience. We had contacted the financial advisor, a real one, a man named Preston who had handled the trust since Evelyn set it up. We brought him in fully. Preston drafted a letter, official letterhead, indicating that the trust transfer required a sign-off meeting with both parties on the morning after the wedding. The Sunday, at Preston's downtown office, 9 a.m. The letter said this was a standard procedural requirement before the funds could be released. Rosie had placed that letter on the nightstand in the bridal suite where Bennett would see it. And then the wedding happened. I walked my daughter down the aisle on a Saturday afternoon in late April with white string lights in the rafters and 212 people watching. I held her hand through my arm, and I felt her fingers grip tight, and I looked straight ahead because I knew if I looked at her face I would lose my composure entirely. At the altar, I kissed her cheek. She squeezed my hand twice, quick, deliberate, which was the signal we'd agreed on. It meant, I'm okay. It meant, I trust you. I let her go. I sat in the front row and watched the ceremony, and I kept my face appropriate, and I thought about Evelyn the entire time. The reception was everything Rosie had planned. The lights, the music, the toasts. My sister Claudette gave a toast that made half the room cry. Bennett danced with Rosie and smiled his practiced smile and thanked me warmly for the evening when he found me near the bar. I shook his hand. I told him to take good care of my daughter. He told me I had nothing to worry about. That night, after the guests had gone and the venue was being broken down, Rosie and Bennett went to the hotel downtown where they'd booked a suite for the wedding night. I drove home and sat in my armchair and didn't sleep. I want to be clear about something, because I know it's the question people ask. Rosie and I had spoken about everything before the wedding day. She made her own choices. She was not ambushed by any of this. She is a grown woman, and she knew exactly what the plan was and what Sunday morning would bring. That was her decision, and I respected it. Sunday morning. At 8:45, Desmond and I were parked outside Preston's office building downtown. Preston was already inside. At 8:58, Bennett arrived. Alone. He was dressed sharply even for a Sunday morning. Slacks, a pressed shirt, hair neat. He had seen the letter. He had come. He didn't know that Rosie was not coming. He didn't know that Rosie was, at that moment, sitting in her car 2 blocks away, with her college roommate beside her and an overnight bag in the back seat. He didn't know that I had spent 10 days building a paper file. The LLC with no assets, the credit card debt, the prior engagement in Dayton, the vacated apartment, and that file was sitting on Preston's desk. He didn't know that Preston had already contacted the county court about a fraud consultation. Bennett walked into that office building at 8:59 with the full confidence of a man who believed he was 45 minutes away from having access to $114,000. Desmond and I walked in 30 seconds behind him. I will spare most of the details of what happened in Preston's office. I will say that it took Bennett approximately 4 minutes to understand the situation, to realize that this was not a trust transfer meeting, that Rosie was not coming, that the file on the desk contained documentation he had not expected anyone to have. I watched the confidence leave his face in stages, the way air goes out of something when you find the right spot. He tried charm first, then confusion, then a version of wounded dignity. The idea that this was some misunderstanding, that his love for Rosie was real, that whatever financial troubles he'd had were behind him. I let him go through all of it. I didn't say much. I just sat there and let him hear himself. When he finished, I told him 3 things. I told him that Rosie had already spoken to an attorney and the marriage would be annulled on grounds that would hold up without any difficulty given what we had. I told him that the Dayton woman had been contacted and was interested in having her own conversation with the right people. And I told him that the only version of this where things stayed quiet, where his name and his methods did not become a matter of public record, was the version where he signed the agreement Preston had prepared, acknowledged the grounds for annulment, and was out of Rosie's life permanently by Monday morning. He signed. He didn't say anything else after that. He just straightened his shirt, stood up, and walked out. I watched him go through the glass door and turn left on the sidewalk and disappear. Then that was the last time I ever saw Bennett Ashford. I called Rosie 2 minutes later. She answered on the first ring. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, Daddy." That was it. 2 words. And I sat in the parking lot of a financial advisor's office on a Sunday morning in Columbus, Ohio. And I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Evelyn's funeral. Not because I was sad, because it was over. Because my daughter was safe. Because I had kept the promise I made to her mother in that hospital room 11 years ago, that I would look after our girl. That I would always look after our girl. Rosie took 2 weeks off work. She stayed at my house the first week, slept in her old room, watched television with me in the evenings, ate the food I made for her. She didn't want to talk about it much, and I didn't push. On the last evening before she went back to her apartment, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "How did you know? From the beginning. How did you know?" I thought about it for a while. "I didn't know anything," I said finally. "I just paid attention." She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's putting something in a place in her mind where she'll keep it. "Mom would have figured it out faster," she said. "Probably," I said. "She always was sharper than me." Rosie laughed. A real one, short and warm, and it was the best sound I had heard in weeks. "The trust fund is still there, still intact. One day Rosie will meet someone who deserves to build a life with her, and Evelyn's gift will go towards something her mother would have been proud of. A home. A future. The real kind. I don't tell this story to make myself out to be some kind of hero. I made mistakes in it. I hesitated too long. I let things go further than maybe they needed to. There are things I'd do differently if I had them to do over. But I'll tell you what I've learned in 63 years, and it is this. Love without attention is just a feeling. It's the attention that does the work. It's showing up and listening and noticing the small things that don't add up, and being willing to be the person who acts when acting is required. Evelyn taught me that, and I did my best to honor it. I keep coming back to that moment behind the wooden fence at the vineyard, the climbing vines, the sound of Bennett's laugh, the way my hands started shaking before my mind had even fully processed what I'd heard. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently, and the honest answer is, not much. Not because I handled everything perfectly, I didn't. I hesitated. I let things go further than they needed to go. And there are nights I still sit with that, but the choices that mattered, the ones that actually protected my daughter, those came from the right place. And I think that's what determines how these things turn out in the end. Not whether you're perfect, whether you're honest about what you owe the people who depend on you. Bennett made a calculation. He looked at Rosie and he saw a number. Her mother's trust fund, $114,000 set aside with love and sacrifice, and he decided that number was worth more than she was. That's not bad luck. That's a choice a man makes over and over again every day he keeps the lie going. And choices like that have weight. They accumulate. They follow you. Bennett had done this before. There was a woman in Dayton before Rosie, and probably someone before her. A man who builds his life on what he can take from others doesn't suddenly stop. He just keeps going until something stops him. What I learned from all of this is that integrity isn't a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do when the easier thing would be to say nothing. To convince yourself it's not your problem. To let someone else figure it out. I could have stayed quiet that day at the vineyard. I could have told myself I'd misheard, that it wasn't my place to interfere in my grown daughter's life. But I knew what I'd heard, and knowing something and doing nothing about it, that's its own kind of failure. The intelligence piece mattered too. Anger alone wouldn't have saved Rosie. If I'd walked up to Bennett that day and confronted him, he would have denied everything. He would have worked on her. He was good at that. What protected her was patience. The 10 days of documentation, the call to Agnes's son in Cincinnati, the dinner with the recorder in my jacket pocket. Thinking before moving. That is what made the difference between my daughter being free and my daughter being tangled up in something that could have taken years to undo. And Rosie. I want to say something about Rosie. Because she is the one who showed real strength in all of this. Not me. She sat at her kitchen table and heard the worst thing a woman can hear about the man she loves, and she didn't fall apart. She asked the right question. How do we fix this? And she held herself together through a dress fitting and a rehearsal dinner and an entire wedding ceremony, all while carrying what she knew. That is not something most people could do. That is a kind of endurance that doesn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere deep in her, and I like to think some of it came from her mother. Evelyn would have been proud of her. I know that without any doubt. Love without attention is just a feeling. I said that at the end of the story, and I meant it. The attention is what does the work. In parenting, in marriage, in friendship, in everything. Showing up for the people you love means more than being present. It means being awake, watching, willing to act when acting costs you something. That's what I tried to do, and for once in my life, it was enough.